Well, welcome back. In this unit, we're going to be focused on chapters 7 and 8 of Harmer, which are on teaching reading and teaching writing. So you should have read chapters 7 and 8 before watching this lecture, and if you haven't had a chance, go ahead and just stop the video, take the time to read, and then come on back. And as we begin, I want you to take a step back from the assumption that we have to teach our students to read and really just ask yourself first, why is getting students to read important for us as teachers of ELLs specifically? Well, there are a lot of reasons for reading. In order to do many things in life, you need to read. For most things in school, you have to be able to read. To do many jobs, especially higher paid, less manual labor jobs, you're going to have to be able to read. Reading can be a great hobby and it's something really pleasurable for people. There are a lot of functions in life that you need to be able to read for. So just things like filling out forms, navigating transit, doing a lot of things is either necessary or a lot easier if you can read. The more you read, the better you get at reading. The more you read, the more you're able to build your vocabulary and have exposure to a lot of different content areas and the kinds of vocabulary that's part of those content areas. Reading can provide a good model for grammar, for punctuation, for other parts of language that students are learning in class. And good reading can stimulate discussion. There can be topics that come out of reading that can be really useful for classroom conversations. There's two different kinds of reading that we're going to look at and talk about today. And the first is extensive reading. So this is kind of more recreational reading. It often happens outside the classroom, though it could be in the classroom as well. It can include reading novels, reading web pages, newspapers, magazines, reference material. It should involve reading for pleasure. Students should have some choice in what they read. And they should also have the opportunity to share about their reading experiences with others. The other kind of reading is intensive reading. So this is going to be more detailed focus on the construction of text, and it's usually accompanied by some kind of study activities. It's usually what we're having our students do in the classroom, and it involves looking at an extract from some kind of text, like a magazine, a poem, website, novel, play, etc. And those study activities that accompany the text usually involve the students working out what kind of text they're reading, what's the genre, maybe discovering details about the meaning, looking at how the grammar and vocabulary are used, using the information from the text in other learning activities, etc. It's important, a few important things to keep in mind when teaching reading are reading levels and reading skills. The success of a reading activity really depends on the level of the text that we choose for our students and making sure it's appropriate for their ability level. Ideally, these are going to be authentic texts that's preferred. So authentic texts are not written especially for English language learners, but for the general population. They are real pieces of writing that exist in the world. Whereas graded readers are written specifically for developing readers, and they are at the various levels that those students should be at. And that's connected to that idea of Creshen's idea of I+1 or comprehensible input. The idea that it's just above the student's current level of comprehension, so it keeps kind of pushing them forward in their learning. Graded readers are especially useful for extensive reading. And it's important then to really kind of just find a balance between using authentic materials and graded readers so that your students are accessing a wide variety of kinds of reading. when we're teaching reading, we have a few skills that we want to help our students be able to do. One is scanning a text, so being able to look for particular pieces of information without reading every word or line in a text. There's also skimming a text, which is trying to get the general idea of a passage without getting bogged down with the details. So again, scanning will involve not reading every word or line, but trying to learn to pick out the key words and phrases to get the big picture of what they're reading. And then there's reading for detailed comprehension. And so that is really the slower reading through every word and line to get the full comprehension of all the details of what they're reading. And students should be taught to understand that there's a difference between these three things and that each skill has its own important role depending on what students are trying to do. So if you look at this list of a few different kinds of texts, pick out a couple of them and think to yourself, are you more likely to be doing intensive or extensive reading with them? Are you more likely to be skimming, scanning, or doing detailed comprehension with them? Look at these 8 different kinds of texts I've listed here. Well, with a novel, I think we would probably be reading extensively, probably for pleasure, and it's probably for more sort of detailed comprehension. We're probably paying attention to every word in line. If we're looking at a recipe, we might be scanning at first to decide whether we have the ingredients that it's listing, but then later maybe reading it for detailed comprehension when we're actually trying to do the recipe. If it's a poem, maybe I'm reading that intensively in class, and then I'd be maybe scanning for a particular rhyme scheme or a pattern of meter. But then poetry can also be something I might be reading extensively, just for fun, outside of class. So some of these different genres of texts are going to fall into the different categories, and we would use these different reading skills based on what our purpose is in reading them. Well, ultimately, we want our students to be able to do extensive reading. We want them to read outside of school. But how do we start to bridge that gap between the intensive reading, which is most of what we'll be doing in class, and extensive reading? There are a number of approaches that we can take. The first is SSR, or sustained silent reading. This is when we give students time in class to read a book or a text of their choice. Maybe you have a library in your classroom and you give them an opportunity to just pick out a book and for an extended period of time have some sustained silent reading. Another approach is SSS, so start with simple stories. Beginning learners can really become overwhelmed with complicated storylines with a lot of details and a lot of complexity. Start with simple ones and let them build up from there. SST is short subsequent tasks. So after students have done any kind of reading, give them small tasks that allow the reader to cement the storyline, to cement the content after they're done reading. Just short tasks, not laborious, but ones that help them to be doing some more focused thinking when it comes to their reading. We should always be also trying to stimulate curiosity in our students when it comes to their reading. So, young people are, especially the very young, they ask a lot of questions. They ask a lot of why. We shouldn't always give them the answer. We should model curiosity. We should investigate with them. We should point them back to books in encouraging them to satisfy their curiosity in looking at reading. It's also important to know your students and know their level. So know their interests, know things that would be engaging for them in their reading, and what level they're at so that what you're giving them are appropriate materials to help them bridge that gap between what they're doing intensively in class to extensively outside of class. Harmer lists a number of important reading principles, and the first is that we should encourage students to read as often and as much as possible. So that's that extensive reading again. So if you're teaching young children, this is going to mean engaging their parents and their families on the importance of reading, helping facilitate them getting a library card and visiting their local library, making reading really a part of the student's home life as well as at school. Students need to be engaged in what they're reading. So again, getting things in their hands that interest them and make them want to read. Encourage students and respond to the content of the text, so both its construction and their feelings about it. When they engage with the content and the message of the text, they should also be encouraged to think about how they feel about the text. Prediction is a major factor in reading engagement. So encouraging your students to think about what's going to happen next, have them look at the cover, look at the picture, see if they can guess what's going to happen in this book. Match the task to the topic when using intensive reading texts. So make sure you're choosing the right kind of questions, the most imaginative and challenging of activities related to the topic. And finally, good teachers exploit reading texts to the full. So we don't want to just have students read for reading's sake, except for free time, except for that sustained silent reading. But if they're reading as part of your classwork, make sure you integrate that reading into an interesting lesson sequence, or use the topic for discussion and for further tasks. On pages 102 to 107, there are 3 examples of reading sequences. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but make sure you have a look at those because they're interesting models. And there's also a number of suggestions for reading activities on pages 107 to 109. So I'd encourage you to go back and look at those suggestions. Maybe pick out 2 that you like the best and think about, why do you like them? What age group, what level do you think that they're ideal for? If you were going to use them, would you do anything special with the activity? Would you modify it in any way? And then also, which activity do you like the least? Why don't you like it? Now we're going to turn to teaching writing, which is really kind of the other side of the coin of teaching reading. And so in TESL, we have those 4 domains: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And reading is one of the receptive domains, while writing is a productive domain, just like listening is a receptive domain and speaking is a productive domain. So similarly, I want us to first think about reasons for teaching writing. Writing can give our students more thinking time and therefore more language processing opportunity. When students are talking, they often don't have a lot of time to think about what they want to say, but writing can give them more time to think than just spontaneous conversation does. They can think about the language, whether it's in study or activation. There's 2 kinds of writing we're going to talk about. One is writing for learning. That's when we apply a certain structure or use new vocabulary words, or we're focused on form again. That's going to be a practice tool for working with language they've been studying, maybe studying paragraphs or punctuation, a specific aspect of writing. And it gives reinforcement for those things that we've been studying. Whereas there's also writing for writing. And that's just in order to become a better writer and more comfortable at writing at any kind. That might be emails, letters, reports of some kind. When we're writing for writing, we're looking at the whole text and not just sort of the pieces of language. What genres do you think are engaging and important for our ELL students? What kind of writing will our students see in the world and need to do? Well, probably all kinds, and we should think of this broadly. So newspaper ads, store flyers, websites, magazines, picture books, short stories. you can do something called genre analysis, which will help students see how typical texts within a genre are constructed, and then after those models, write their own text in the style of particular genres. And when you do that, say you show students a magazine article and you look at all the different aspects of it and break it down, and then give students an opportunity to write within the same kind of genre, you're going to find your lowest level students might just copy the original and do a really kind of rote imitation. And that's okay at first. As they do more, and as their facility with the language grows, they're going to be able to express themselves more creativity in a genre analysis activity. So you may have learned about the writing process. You may have gone through the stages of the writing process yourselves as writers. And in the non-ESL world, in kind of the mainstream classroom, typically we're taught to write in a sort of linear fashion. You start with planning, move on to drafting, you review your draft, you edit, and then you complete a final draft and submit it. For ELLs, the process can be quite a bit more circular. You might start with planning, complete a draft, go back to planning, draft again, do some editing, maybe re-edit a bit more, consider going back to the planning stages and rethinking. Why would there be a difference with ELL writers than with native language writers? Well, when you work with ELLs on their writing for writing, there are likely to be a lot of different sort of issues at play, what we might call higher order concerns and lower order concerns. So if we have them do a linear approach where they just plan, draft, review, edit, turn in their final draft, we're going to get a piece of writing that if we corrected all the errors and gave it back to them, it would really be too overwhelming for the student. They wouldn't possibly be able to integrate all of that feedback and corrections in a way that would help them learn. So when you do a writing process with English language learners, the first time around, at first you have to allow for this circular process with a lot of feedback along the way. The first time around, you maybe focus on those, what we call higher order concerns. That's things like the big picture, planning the organization of the writing, the clarity of their meaning. If you're writing an essay, that things like the thesis, their points of development, those sorts of things. And you're going to focus on the concerns or the errors that are most prevalent and that are most going to impede their meaning, not the nitty-gritty stuff. And then the second time around, when you're doing edits and feedback with your learners and their writing, that's when you can get into maybe some of those more lower order concerns, those smaller details, things like sentence structure, spelling, punctuation, etc. Some students are going to say they can't write. They don't want to. They lack the confidence. They think it's boring. They just don't think they have anything to say. If we can help them build the habit of writing, we'll start to see more confidence and more writing ability. So one way to do that is by assigning writing with a wide range of difficulty, as easier writing builds the habit. So small writing assignments that you do frequently. This could look like having them write postcards in which they focus on just one or two writing goals, maybe articles and contractions, and have that be part of a postcard they write to a friend or a family member. Maybe interview writing. Give them some questions, have them read some models of interviews, and then pair up and interview each other and write up the interview. Small writing activities that you do on a frequent basis that kind of lower the bar of writing that may feel intimidating, and also build up their habit and their skill at writing. Can you think of other ways to build the habit of writing? Give that some more thought, because it's important for us as teachers to try and think outside the box. What do you think about students translating their own L1 writing? So writing first in their first language and then translating it into English. There's actually a lot of controversy in the TESL world about whether it's okay to have students first write in their L1 and translate to their L2. But luckily, there's been quite a bit of research on this. There's a study at the University of Minnesota that looked at translated versus direct writing. So writing first in L1, translating to L2, or just writing first in the L1. And while raters found no significant differences in the grammatical scales across the two types of writing, differences did emerge in the scales for expression, transitions, and clauses. So in other words, the grammar in both the translated writing and the direct writing was about the same, but the translated writing was more expressive. It was richer. And this is likely because students may have better use of writing conventions in their first language, and then they can bring them over to their second language, what we might call positive transfer. And there have been other studies with similar similar conclusions. So encouraging your students to be writing both in their first language and in their second language in English can have some really positive effects. So it's best to be involved with students in their writing process throughout and at different points throughout the process to give them feedback, both about their form and about their content. Responding to their writing is vital, and it's instrumental in helping them to improve their writing. Talk through those issues with them before the final product is submitted. Stephen Krashen, whom we've talked about with I+1 and comprehensible input, he said that student errors will begin to go away as students begin to acquire certain features of the language correctly. And if you focus too much on form, they may have little cognitive energy left for meaning. So if we're so focused on fixing errors and making sure the forms are correct, they may never have much opportunity to develop the meaning and focus on that part of what they're writing. It is super important not to overcorrect ESL student writing. It is a surefire way to give them a visual symbol that their written English is terrible. And so when we are working on correcting student writing and providing them feedback, it's important to maybe focus on just one or two kinds of mistakes. Maybe it's punctuation or spelling or a particular grammar form per assignment. And let them know that when you give work back. You can tell them, I didn't correct all of the issues, but I just noted specifically your prepositions today, so that they know that that's what they are looking at. Or another strategy is to use a list of written symbols. So if you're grading work and you've established a symbol system that your students have been provided, so they help them understand what your symbols are, you might write something like WO for wrong word order and S for spelling mistake. And then you can mark those in a much more discreet way that doesn't look like a paper full of red ink when they get it back. It's much more manageable for them to receive. There are different kinds of errors that students make. One is a developmental error, and that's just a natural part of learning a language. It might be things like use of articles or use of prepositions. In English, those are both forms that are very difficult for ELLs and will continue to be problematic for them even as they become much more advanced learners. So those sort themselves out, but it takes longer. Those are ones that we don't need to focus on too terribly. The writing errors that really are going to take priority, that we want to give our students feedback and error correction on, are those that are at risk of fossilizing or becoming permanent in their learner language. And also those that confuse real meaning, that make it hard to understand what they're trying to say. Things like subject-verb agreement, double negatives, irregular verb forms, irregular plural nouns. Those are ones that you should address. But what if the majority of your students' issues are not developmental and there are many errors in several categories? Well, in that case, you should really just try and focus on those that are impeding meaning and those that are repeated, that you're seeing again and again. Once you have an opportunity to help students over time work on those that are impeding meaning and that are repeated, then you can move on to the next categories. You're going to be doing an activity today that's related to error analysis, which is when you identify deviations from the target language norms in the course of gradual second language acquisition and instruction. And when you're doing this, when you look at mistakes, you've got to ask yourself, is this a slip? Is this an error? Or is this an attempt? So if you can't remember, we had talked about those are back on page 96. Have a look at what the difference between those things are, because the different kinds of mistakes call for a different kind of feedback. If something's an error, if something is a mistake that your student actually doesn't understand the correct way to form the language that they are trying to form, that's when you provide explicit written correction in response to the mistakes. You basically give them the answer because they're not going to be able to figure it out on by themselves. But if it's something like a slip, where you believe that the student actually does know how to do this well, they just made a mistake, you can give indirect feedback, which is alerting the student to the error using either general comments or giving students the opportunity to fix the mistake themselves. That's, again, maybe using those error codes where instead of writing in the correct word order yourself, you just write word order and let them sort it out. Instead of writing in the correct preposition, you just make a note for preposition and let them sort it out. There are some good examples of writing sequences on pages 114, 118. I'm not going to spend time here on those, but make sure you read those through because they're good models, and also similarly some good writing activity suggestions on pages 118 to 120. So just like with the reading suggestions, I'd like you to go through those and think about them a bit. Think about ones you might like to use, ones that would be appropriate for the level and age of the students you're going to be teaching, ways you might modify some of them to be appropriate to your context, ones that you don't like and why that might be. Give a little bit of thought to those suggestions. So next, just go to that task list, have a look at the details and all the activities for day 8, and I will see you next time.